Hello, and welcome back to the Cracking Fang YouTube channel. Today, we're doing another ramble style video, and the topic of today's video is cultural differences I've noticed between working in the United States and in the United Kingdom. This video will be quite a long one, so grab a drink and a snack and listen in, or put it on in the background while you do some housework, whatever works for you. The background of today's video is just some footage of a recent business trip I did to Menlo Park. Before we begin, just want to ask you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me grow and shows that you're enjoying the content. Okay, let's get into it. For some context, I've worked in the United States for most of my career. About over a year ago, I made the decision to transfer to Meta's London office and take on a new opportunity. It's been an interesting experience so far, and here's some of the things I've noticed in no particular order of importance. The first is compensation, and let's get this one out of the way. Compensation is certainly less than it is in the US. It's an unfortunate reality that you'll need to come to grips with when making the trade-off between the two locations. I've estimated that overall, the total compensation difference is something like 35 to 40% in terms of raw net pay. The US also has a better tax regime, especially true if you're working in a state with no state income tax like Washington, Texas, or Florida. That being said, the compensation here is still fantastic. You are extremely well paid and money is not an issue. I can comfortably live by myself, pay all my bills, and travel abroad frequently without ever worrying about money. As a matter of fact, even with just my base salary, this is true. The bonus and RSU are just extra for me as far as I'm concerned. So while you will be making less in the UK and taxed higher, unfortunately, money won't really be an issue. You'll be better off than 99% of people, and you can live a very high standard of living. I won't lie and say that knowing the salary differential doesn't get me down sometimes, as it really does, but I don't really have any desire to return to the US anytime soon, so with all things software engineering, it's a trade-off. Okay, with compensation out of the way, let's now talk about the overall work environment and what the differential between the continents is. From a demographic standpoint, the London office, much like the US offices, is a mix of nationalities. Now, this topic can be a bit tricky because the exact definition of what makes a person one nationality or another is complex. And for this exercise, let's just assume that a country where a person did their pre-university education, so, elementary school, middle school, high school, whatever the equivalent is around the world, that's where they're from. In the UK, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, the largest demographic by count is by far Eastern European, Russian and Ukrainians being the largest proportion of that. After that, I'd say that the second is probably from India, and third place, it's people from the UK and Ireland. And this is a bit of a contrast to how it was in America, where probably a vast majority of people were American, and the second and third spots were split somewhere between people from India and China. I find it a bit humorous that in the UK office, most people are not British, but anyway, that's a conversation for another day. The reason that I bring about the demographic distributions is that this, of course, has a large impact on the mentality and the work culture between the offices. And here, we'll need to lean into some generalizations and stereotypes. While there is a stereotype of Eastern Europeans being hardworking and having a strong work ethic, working in the UK is massively more laid back than it is in the United States. And there are several reasons for this. Let's examine them. Okay, the first reason is that people are not really as obsessed with their jobs as they are in America. People in the States really buy into the notion of defining their entire identity around the job they have, the name of the firm that they work for, the title and the rank of their role, the salary they receive. It's a sort of obsession, and they definitely place too much importance on these superficial things to the point where it pushes people to work themselves into the ground and center their entire self-worth and self-esteem around their work. This isn't to say that Europeans are lazy, quite the opposite. People here are just as smart and talented as those across the Atlantic. The difference is that here there's a very clear and defined separation between work and life. From my observations, people, once the day is done, switch off and don't allow themselves to be dragged in after hours. Things that aren't genuinely urgent and can be done the next morning will be done the next morning. There's no need to answer emails after 6 p.m. There's no need to respond to work chats, just let it go. Work is work and personal life is personal life. Europeans are certainly much better at understanding and adhering to this. The second difference is that people actually take vacations here. And perhaps Meta is not exactly the best example of this because in the US you actually will get 21 days of PTO per year, but in general terms, Americans receive and take far fewer days off than in Europe. I looked on Wikipedia, and here's something fascinating I found. In the UK, the minimum days off per year is 20. Take a guess as to what it is in the US. Zero. Literally fucking zero legally mandated days. The average across the nation is something like 10 days, but I can't be the only one looking at this and thinking what the actual fuck is going on here. For reference, Afghanistan gets 20 days plus 15 national holidays. I find this absolutely insane. In my time in the US, even though people had 21 days of PTO per year, it was extremely common that people simply wouldn't use it. The amount of times I heard coworkers tell me that they simply had too many accrued hours and they would need to burn off some time by taking a day off was simply eyebrow raising. And guess what? Even on these off days, they were still working. This just baffles the mind. Here in the UK, and I suppose in broader Europe, it's not that uncommon to just take 2 to 3 weeks off in August and switch off all email, chat, and everything and just get away. And guess what? Nobody bats an eye. Nobody will think less of you. Nobody will think you're a coaster or you're lazy. It's just normal and encouraged. People need time to decompress and unwind. A candle that burns twice as bright will burn half as long. It's no surprise that suffering from burnout is such a common phenomenon in the US. The last cultural difference I want to talk about is in Europe, there's really no cultural obsession or idolization of money. One thing that is undeniably true about America is that there is this overarching obsession with money, with consumerism, hustling, with flexing your life's accomplishments. Oh, I went to X school, got X, Y diploma, and now I work at Z company making N hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. Now, I'm not arguing that wanting to achieve the best you can in your life is a bad thing. It's not a bad thing to want to have a successful and lucrative career in whatever field you work in. But what I notice that whenever it's taken to obsessive levels and people start idolizing a title on a business card or material possessions, it rarely leads to happiness. While it's certainly true that Europeans are also career-driven and want to do well for themselves, it just comes back to the juxtaposition that here, work is not the center of most employees' lives. There is an off switch, and unlike in America, it's not just sitting there collecting dust. People use it. They turn off. People are much less willing to trade their personal lives and time with friends and family in exchange for more money. While most people will be attracted by the prospect of making $500,000 a year working at a high-frequency trading firm, most would not be willing to work the 80-plus hour weeks and deal with the constant stress. There's a greater sense of contentment with life, and that money really isn't everything. Okay, now that we're starting to get a little philosophical here, let's pull things back and return to the original prompt of the video, which was how the cultural differences impact the work environment. We've already examined some of the core cultural differences, but how do these manifest themselves on the work environment in the literal sense? My first observation on this point is that there is a big difference in the day-to-day collaboration between the two continents. I found that working with my colleagues in London to be much more stress-free and relaxed. People come off as nicer, more collaborative, and less combative and pushy when compared with my American colleagues. Collaborations tend to just be easier, and there's less friction. Of course, this does come with pros and cons. I can usually expect that I'll receive a prompt and quick response to messages when sent to a colleague in the US than I can here in Europe. And typically I'll get information I need or follow up on something a lot faster. Another and very annoying difference is working between time zones. Unfortunately, most people in the US offices are on a Pacific time zone. And what this means is that between there and London is 8-hour difference, or one workday's hours. This is the pain in the ass because as soon as you're ready to log off for the day, your American colleagues are actually logging on. And this becomes extremely annoying because any team meetings that involve partings from both sides will almost always be at or after 5 p.m. London time. It's a really unfair reality that Europeans are readily expected to stay late and dial into meetings with American colleagues, but the opposite is almost never true. Try to ask your American colleagues to dial in at 7:30, 8, 8:30 a.m. and watch the absolute meltdown. The double standard here is terrible. We're expected to sacrifice our evenings, but God forbid you ever ask them to wake up early. It's shit, and we're likely never going to change this, so keep this in mind when picking your team if you find yourself in a team selection process. Having a dependency on the West Coast is a massive pain in the ass. And one more thing to be aware of is that I've noticed that in the London office, people are more readily making jokes and laughing around with their coworkers than in the US. I've definitely heard some jokes and opinions that would spark an absolute meltdown in the US, but here they're just laughed off. There's certainly a cultural difference here, and even though there is a sense of political correctness creeping into UK society, like I mentioned before, most people in the office are Eastern European, and such concepts as wokeness and political correctness are just laughed at. Jokes that would be microaggressions in California are just banter in the UK, and it's a massive breath of fresh air. You don't always have to be worrying that someone, somewhere, at some time might be offended and you might get stitched up by HR. Of course, there are always some people lingering around who just love to be offended at literally everything, but they're pretty easy to spot and stay away from, or at least you can hold your tongue until they leave. I personally can't stand environments of wokeness or political correctness, so being in the London office is definitely a massive plus. So I think this is probably a good place to wrap up and leave any other lingering thoughts for a follow-up video. A 20-minute video isn't really conducive to modern attention spans, so let's just call it here. To sum things up, there's definitely a massive cultural difference between working in the US and the UK. It's an unfortunate reality that our American colleagues get paid more for the same work, but it's important to also remember that this leads itself to an environment of greater stress, overworking, burnout, and a worse work-life balance. All things in software engineering come with a trade-off, and where you choose to work is no different. Me personally, I don't have any desire to return to the United States, but I can see how the massive salaries for software engineers can entice people. I won't downplay that there you will be paid probably the highest salary in the world for the work that you'll do as an engineer. But it's also worthwhile understanding the cost you'll pay and incorporate this into your decision-making process to make the most informed, data-driven decision. Though I, from my own personal experience, paint a pretty gloomy picture of working in the States, the UK is not perfect either. In a follow-up video, I'll focus on the pros and cons of working here on its own in terms of what I like and what I don't like. Thanks again for watching. Remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Have a good one. Bye.